And we'll start with you, Doug, and we can just go in that order until we're finished. First question. If you had to sign a balanced budget and it meant cutting social programs, would you do it to balance the budget?
I think balancing a budget and making cuts in what we spend and cutting services is a false argument. I think you can balance a budget. I think you can reduce the size of state government, and I think you can do it without cutting services. You know, our government is so bloated right now, and the money we spend can still go to social services and other services. You look at what's happening in Albuquerque in public education. The city of Albuquerque public school system is not even cutting senior administrative salaries. And what are they cutting? They're cutting teachers in the classroom. I think our priorities are totally messed up in Santa Fe, and I think we can continue to provide high quality services in a much more efficient way.
All right, Susanna?
It is a constitutional requirement that we balance our budget, and we have to continue to remember how we got where we are today. We are in a deficit because of the overspending. Not only the $500 million that the previous governor left us, but beyond that into the $600, $700, $800 million deficit that we're at now. Now, there's a budget that's been proposed and signed. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to cut back those positions that have been created ever since the governor became the governor and Diane Denish became the lieutenant governor. That's where we have to start. We must make sure the services that we're providing are the services that are necessary. We cannot provide jobs just for political appointments and political jobs just to make sure people continue to donate or elect certain officials. If you do the job right, you cut back on the spending, you bring back the revenue that we have cut by cutting our oil and gas and our dairies and over-regulating the businesses and the construction sites, etc. We've got to return the revenue at the same time that we shrink the size of government. We cannot have a big government and a big economy. You have one or the other, and then the other one will take the money out of your pockets to make sure we have that large government. We cannot tolerate that any further. We must cut back on those political positions. That's the first thing we have to do.
Thank you. Janice Arnold-Jones.
The simple answer, two simple answers. The first one is yes. The second one, elect Republicans. You know, and I say that because I have been on the floor. And one of the things you may not recognize is the current administration has actually, by directive, said that the revenue of our state and our budget are not linked in any way. I don't know about y'all, but I find that revenue and budget are intrinsically linked. And so we are working on a $5.374 billion budget, and I can only find $4.7 billion in revenue. There is something terribly wrong. You got to get your mind right. Please elect some Republicans. So, with that in mind, we are going to have to set some priorities. The situation is worse than you think. I actually believe we will be back in special session by August. The situation with our natural gas is actually worse, and what has happened is our natural gas industry has been put at a competitive disadvantage. And here's the really bad news. New York, Pennsylvania, and Alabama are extracting natural gas at $1.35 an MCF. Because of the pit rules, it costs our industry $2.75 an MCF. We're going to make them bankrupt. The answer is you have to be responsible when you budget. A governor can do that.
If elected governor, will you send armed New Mexico National Guard members to our southern borders? If not, why not?
Initially, I would not send armed National Guard officers to the border. What we need to do is to make sure we support the officers that are on the front line right now. We have Sheriff's Department officers throughout the border, throughout the state of New Mexico, that have been working hand in hand and are cross-commissioned. They are also working hand in hand with the Border Patrol and Customs. They have done a very good job in recent years to ensure the security of our border. We live just a stone throw away from the murder capital of the world. They are most informed as to what is happening, and they have secured our border to ensure that that violence isn't crossing over. The district attorneys along that border also belong to HIDTA, High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, who also have done a great job, along with the United States Attorney's Office, to ensure we're prosecuting those that are trafficking in humans for the purpose of slavery, for the purpose of sexual offenses, for the purposes of drug trafficking. We work together hand in hand and make sure that we're not giving incentives for these individuals to come to our country, to come to our state, such as sanctuary cities, such as giving them driver's licenses when they're not entitled to driver's licenses. When we start making or giving incentives for them to come to this state, that's when we lose the war. We have to make sure our local law enforcement are supported at 100% before that option is considered. And I think that this administration has failed to do that.
Thank you. Janice Arnold-Jones.
This week, a good friend of our farming and ranching communities, Robert Krantz, was murdered. I know you know that. This week, I called on the governor to call in the National Guard. And I was so angry because for 5 years, it has been evident that the Boot Heel had no 911 coverage. It did not have enough radio and cell phone coverage to even protect our Border Patrol agents, our sheriffs, or the National Guard. It is an FCC issue, and here's the real simple truth of what's happening. Drug runners coming from Mexico, their cell phones and their radios have broad range frequency. In our nation, we limit those frequencies. It's like sending a police officer in with a water balloon against an Uzi. It's not right, it's not fair. There are a lot of issues, and Susanna did a good job of describing those issues, but you have to be willing to stand up for your state. We have citizens whose property is being trampled, their lives are threatened, their homes are broken into, and our governor, our existing one, has known this. He stood by, he knew it, he did nothing. I'm angry, and I will not behave that way. The job of governor is to protect the citizens of New Mexico.
Thank you. Doug Turner.
Last June, I had a meeting with the state adjutant general, and I learned then that we already have 75 members of our National Guard at the border, and they have been there for quite some time, and they're doing a job that the federal government is supposed to be doing. So we've already got our National Guardsmen and women at our border doing border protection work. Today, the National Guard determined that they were going to send additional National Guardsmen to the border. And so I support those activities, but what I really think that we need a governor who forces the federal government and who lobbies day and night, forces the federal government to do the job that it's supposed to do in protecting our borders. Aside from the fact that we shouldn't be providing illegal aliens with legal IDs, we need to make sure that the feds do what they're supposed to do. We are bearing the burden of that in many ways, not only in terms of financial cost, but cost in lives, cost in additional crime into our communities. So yes, I would continue to put National Guardsmen on the border if it was necessary, but we've got to have a governor who's willing to stand up to the federal government and force them to do the job that they're supposed to do.
Okay. If you were elected governor, what actions, if any, would you be willing to support against the federal government declaring private land a national monument, such as is contemplated with the Otero Mesa here in Alamogordo?
You know, I'm a mom. Moms say no. And we say no for good reasons, because it's not good for your children, it is not good for the state. As your governor, I intend to say no. No to wilderness areas that will bring our border all the way to I-10. No to the Otero monuments. No to the energy corridors that will take your land. No to the wildlife corridors that will also take your land. You know, at some point, your governor has to stand up for the state of New Mexico. And you know what? I'm going to lay money on the table today that any one of us could stand here and tell them no, and it'll still take 18 months for the federal government to get here, but you got to be willing to take the consequences. I'm willing to do that. And the answer is no.
Thank you, ma'am. Doug Turner.
I agree with Janice, but I think that the question speaks to a larger issue that we face, and that is federal encroachment, increasing federal encroachment on our lives. If we look at what has happened with the health care bill, if we look at what is the failure of the federal government to manage our border. If we look at continued unfunded mandates that we are forced to comply with, we have the federal government slowly taking more and more and more. And it's terrible. When that health care bill passed, I was so depressed at what had happened, not only for the increased federal mandates, but for the increased federal governance and control over our lives. And so I think this year, if we elect more and more Republican governors around this country, we can all go to Washington together. We did this in 1994 when there were 34 Republican governors elected. We went and we told Bill Clinton that we wanted more control over our rights as states, and we got it. And we have been losing it ever since. So this election year, we need to elect more Republican governors, go to Washington, and protect our rights as states. I firmly believe in states' rights. And if we don't stand up for ourselves, no one is going to do it for us.
I absolutely support action against there being an identification of the Otero Mesa as a national monument. Our current administration invited the federal government here to declare it a national monument. Again, the current administration includes Diane Denish, and it does not include us. We need to make sure that those kinds of decisions are made by the people, and they're not being made by the people. There is an administration right now that thinks that they can identify for the environmentalists a national monument, that they can identify whether whether wells are drilled in certain places or not, whether our economy grows. We are killing our state, and it is an unfortunate consequence that we find ourselves in the deficit that we are in. Wilderness area, I do not support at all. The discussions that are being discussed right now is to identifying a wilderness area down southern part of our state where vehicles cannot go into, where you cannot fly over, you cannot walk into. We are a border state. We must make sure our borders are safe and secure. To identify a wilderness area down by the southern part of the state is insanity. We must make sure to protect the state's rights. Private land must remain private in the state of New Mexico, and we must honor the 10th Amendment. We must take care of ourselves.